Amid the whirling snow, a young child stood shaking, pressed against the brick wall, gripping a hollow lunch container. When the solitary wealthy man gently inquired about her situation, she murmured that she couldn't enter until she secured food for dinner. His spirit shattered, and his subsequent actions would transform her destiny completely. The blizzard had descended unexpectedly upon Portland, Maine, sweeping across the urban landscape in dense, spinning curtains that obscured the neon shop signs and blanketed everything in an unforgiving white silence. Jonathan Blake should have reached his residence by this hour, withdrawing to the refined stillness of his high-rise apartment. Yet the remnants of the business meeting continued to torment his mind as he took a shortcut along the narrow street behind Lambert's Market. The atmosphere was biting, each inhalation stinging, and the sole sounds were his footsteps crushing ice and the distant, muted horn of a water taxi somewhere on the frozen harbor. He almost overlooked her. She appeared so diminutive and motionless that she merged with the masonry and shadows. A young girl, perhaps 6 years old, standing by herself near the wall wearing a torn pink frock that flapped helplessly in the wind. Her uncovered feet were positioned on darkened slush, toes curled inward, skin mottled crimson and tender. She remained still and silent, not turning or stirring, even as snowflakes clung to her matted hair, and a subtle tremor ran through her small frame. She simply remained there, hugging the cold brick, arms stiff at her sides, face mere inches from the wall. Initially, Jonathan assumed she was in distress, perhaps hiding from someone, or possibly lost and awaiting assistance. However, as he approached, her body stiffened abruptly like a frightened creature, shoulders jerking so violently that he halted immediately. The expression she cast him over her shoulder wasn't merely cautious, but tormented, eyes wide and glassy, mouth pressed tightly shut, as though any noise or movement could invite danger. He lowered himself down, making sure to keep his voice soft. "Hello, dear. Are you all right? Have you been hurt?" She winced at his question, then slowly moved her head from side to side. For a moment, she remained silent. Then, so quietly he nearly didn't catch it, she whispered that she couldn't come inside until she learned how to secure dinner. Her lips were becoming blue, and her fingers, he noticed now, were rigid and split, grasping an old plastic lunch container against her chest like protective armor. The unicorn decal on the cover was worn and torn. The edges were mended with peeling adhesive tape. Jonathan's gaze shifted from her to the loading entrance of the store, but no sign of anyone else appeared. No adult, no companion, no recognizable face keeping watch over her. "Who brought you here?" he asked softly. "My aunt," the girl replied. "She tells me that if I don't bring something home, I remain out here. So I improve at it." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He glanced down the narrow passage, suddenly conscious of how truly isolated she was and how little protection existed between her and the storm. "What do they call you?" he said. She paused, eyes darting from his face to his shoes and back. "Ellie," she whispered. "Ellie," he repeated and knelt next to her in the slush, disregarding the moisture seeping into his pants. "May I assist you? Can I bring you somewhere warm?" Ellie shook her head, though without certainty. More like she had been trained to refuse automatically. "She says I must remain. I'm not allowed to depart until she permits it." Jonathan observed her shivering, watched her attempt to appear courageous, try to vanish within herself. He realized she was accustomed to being invisible, used to the world moving past without stopping, without acknowledging her terror or her pain. Her lunch container was vacant. She opened it for him, almost as if ashamed. "I didn't take anything," she whispered. "It's simply empty." His heart lurched. He removed his heavy wool overcoat, wrapped it gently around her small shoulders, and tucked it beneath her chin. For a moment, she went rigid as if anticipating a strike, but then she collapsed into the warmth with a sigh so small it nearly destroyed him. Snow dusted her eyelashes. The wind tugged at the edge of her dress. Jonathan looked at her, at the cracked lunch container and her raw feet and the way her voice had sounded when she said, "Secure dinner." He glanced again at the silent windows above the grocery and felt a cold, ancient rage burning behind his ribs. He couldn't abandon her. He didn't even contemplate it. The memory of his sister Claire flashed through his mind, her face thin and hopeful. The final time he saw her, just before the system lost her. Ellie glanced up at him, uncertain, as if waiting for the world to return to cruelty. But Jonathan remained. He knelt in the snow and wrapped his arms gently around her, shielding her from the wind. "You're no longer alone," he said, his voice trembling with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "Not tonight." As the city disappeared behind thick veils of snow and the storm enclosed them, Jonathan knew this was the moment everything transformed. For reasons he couldn't yet identify, he chose to remain, and he would not allow her to stand alone against the wall ever again. The storm intensified throughout the night, striking the city with fists of snow and rattling the old glass panels above the market. Jonathan barely noticed the cold as he stood outside the weather department door, his own coat still draped around Ellie, who walked beside him with cautious, silent steps. The ascent up the external staircase had been slow, Ellie grimacing with each barefoot step on the splintered wood. He wanted to lift her, but she pulled away, too accustomed to managing things herself. The little girl clutched her empty lunch container to her chest like a secret. Her face was pale, but her eyes bright with something between hope and terror. He knocked. The corridor inside the building was a tunnel of peeling wallpaper and stale odors, cooking oil, cigarettes, the faint trace of mildew. After several moments, the door swung open. Marlene Doyle, Ellie's aunt, stared out at them. She was a thin, sharp-edged woman in her mid-40s with restless hands and narrow lips pressed tight around a cigarette. She looked Jonathan up and down, then at Ellie, and something like irritation flickered across her face. "What's this about?" Marlene demanded, voice raspy. Before Jonathan could respond, Ellie shrank behind him, eyes fixed on the floor. Jonathan forced a calm smile. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Jonathan Blake. I discovered your niece outside in the snow. She was without shoes. She mentioned she couldn't enter until she brought food." Marlene's expression changed instantly, a practiced indignation sliding into place. "She's always fabricating tales," she said with a dismissive gesture. "The girl has an overactive imagination, that one. Nothing but trouble from the day she arrived." "She was trembling, ma'am," Jonathan said quietly. "Her lips were blue." "That's not fiction." Marlene scoffed. "Listen, I work extended hours. Sometimes she forgets the rules. She needs to learn responsibility. If you coddle her, she'll never toughen up. This is a harsh world." Jonathan studied her, his mind recording every detail. The stale smoke in the air, the chipped linoleum, the sink full of dishes behind her shoulder. He wanted to argue, to demand explanations, but Ellie pressed closer against his leg, so small and uncertain, and it was clear this was not a home where arguments were won with words. "Is there anything you need?" "I could purchase some groceries," he began, searching for some crack in Marlene's armor, but Marlene bristled, eyes narrowing. "We don't need your charity. And you shouldn't be meddling in other people's family matters. She'll be fine. She always is." Jonathan knelt down to meet Ellie's gaze, searching her face for any sign of defiance or hope. She wouldn't look at him, but her hand crept into the pocket of his coat. Without a word, she pressed a folded piece of paper into his palm. Her fingers were shaking. Jonathan stood and nodded to Marlene, his patience threadbare. "If you ever need anything," he said, "please don't hesitate to ask." He waited, but Marlene just snorted and slammed the door. The deadbolt clicked. In the corridor, under the sickly yellow light, Jonathan unfolded the paper. It was a child's crayon drawing, rough, urgent lines, a black box thick with shadow, and inside it a small figure crouched alone. There was a big red X on the door, and a padlock drawn with heavy, angry marks. Jonathan's hands trembled as he refolded the drawing. That image, a child locked in darkness, burrowed deep, pulling up memories he'd spent years learning to forget. His sister Claire, in the foster system, tiny and brave, passed from stranger to stranger until the world simply swallowed her up. He had been too late to save her. He'd promised himself he would never be too late again. That night, Jonathan returned to his penthouse, but the quiet didn't comfort him the way it once did. The city below glowed behind frosted glass, but every light seemed dimmer, every luxury more hollow. He spread Ellie's crayon drawing on the kitchen counter beside his phone, next to the business cards and neat stacks of project files that suddenly seemed irrelevant. He tried to read, but the words blurred together. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ellie barefoot in the snow, and Marlene's face, all sharp corners and indifference. He wondered how many other children in the city were standing in the cold right now, silent and unseen, waiting for someone to notice they were missing. By midnight, the only thing he could hear was the wind rattling against his window and the soft echo of Ellie's voice in his memory. His mind kept circling back to Claire, the little sister he couldn't protect. He'd buried himself in work for years to forget that failure, to convince himself it was fate, not his fault. But he knew now some scars don't fade with time. They fade when you finally step up for someone else. As the storm howled outside and the city huddled beneath its blanket of snow, Jonathan rose from his bed. He walked to the kitchen, picked up the drawing, and stared at it until resolve replaced the ache in his chest. He would return. He didn't have a plan, just a promise. Silent but absolute. Ellie Carter wouldn't be left in the cold again. Not if he had anything to say about it. And this time, he would not look away. The following morning, the city awakened to a world transformed by snow. Sidewalks were buried beneath thick white drifts, and the windows above Lambert's grocery glowed pale with the dim light of a Portland winter. Jonathan Blake arrived early, moving with determination. He stopped at a cafe on the corner, purchasing 2 hot chocolates, a paper bag of fresh pastries, and a shoebox wrapped in brown paper from the children's store that had just opened for the day. He hesitated outside the building, watching his breath curl in the frozen air, gathering the resolve to climb the stairs. When he knocked, there was no answer. The hallway felt even colder than the street. He waited, knocked again, louder this time. After a pause, he heard small feet shuffling on linoleum. The door cracked open just a sliver. Ellie's face appeared in the gap, weary and tired. Her hair tangled and eyes bloodshot with sleeplessness. She was alone. He knelt so they were level. "Good morning, Ellie," he said softly. "I brought breakfast and something else." He held up the shoebox and the bag. "Is your aunt home?" Ellie shook her head, glancing over her shoulder like a mouse, checking for the cat. "She left early. Sometimes she doesn't return until dark." She opened the door a bit more, letting him see the cramped apartment beyond. Dishes stacked in the sink, a battered sofa, a television set frozen on static, and the faint stale scent of cigarettes. The kitchen window was cracked, letting in icy air. Jonathan entered carefully, setting the food on the coffee table. Ellie hovered by the doorway, uncertain, as if expecting to be scolded for letting him in. "It's okay," he said, smiling gently. "I promise. I just want to make sure you're warm." He opened the shoebox and pulled out a brand new pair of purple winter boots, soft wool socks, and a child's sweater, deep blue, the kind that would bring out the warmth in her eyes if she ever allowed herself to smile. "These are for you. No more bare feet, okay?" Ellie stared at them like she wasn't sure if they were real. Jonathan crouched beside her, unwrapping the socks and slipping them gently over her frozen toes. Her feet were so small in his hands, red and bruised. She didn't flinch. She was too tired even for that. He poured the hot chocolate into a mug and offered it to her. Steam rose in lazy curls, filling the room with the scent of cocoa and cinnamon. Ellie cradled the mug, eyes wide, letting the heat seep into her palms. She took a sip, closing her eyes, as if for a moment the storm outside had been banished by sugar and kindness alone. He offered her a pastry, breaking it into soft pieces and arranging them on a napkin. She ate slowly, chewing each bite as if she expected it to be taken away. After breakfast, Jonathan asked, "Can you show me your room, Ellie?" She hesitated, eyes flicking to the hallway. Finally, she nodded and led him past the kitchen to a closet just off the living room. The door was heavy, the paint chipped, and when she opened it, the space inside was barely big enough for a child to stand up in. There was a stained mat on the floor, a battered plastic bucket, and a single threadbare blanket. No pillow, no light bulb in the socket overhead. "She puts me in here when I'm bad," Ellie whispered, almost too softly to hear. "Sometimes at night. Sometimes in the afternoon. If I'm quiet, the dark is nicer." Jonathan felt his breath catch. He crouched inside the doorway, looking at her, his voice rough with emotion. "You shouldn't ever have to be in here. No one should." He wanted to shout, to tear the door off its hinges, to carry her out and never let her see the inside of that closet again. Instead, he put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Would you come with me, just for a little while? My friend's a doctor at the hospital. She can make sure you're healthy, and you can bring your lunchbox if you want." Ellie hesitated, her whole body tense. "Will Marlene be mad?" Jonathan shook his head. I'll talk to her. You did nothing wrong. This isn't your fault. She hugged her lunchbox tighter, but then, as if some invisible wall had finally crumbled, she nodded. Only if I can bring this, she whispered, holding the cracked box close. Of course, he said. He helped her into the new boots and sweater, marveling at how tiny her hands looked as she zipped the front. When she was bundled up, they walked together through the apartment, Jonathan locking the door behind them and slipping a note under the edge for Marlene. Ellie is safe. Call me if you have questions. Jonathan Blake. He left his business card, certain Marlene would be furious, but unable to care. They moved through the city, snow falling in thick, fat flakes. The world felt strangely silent, almost reverent, as if the day itself were holding its breath. The pediatric wing of Maine Medical Center was warm and bright, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold and shadows that had shaped Ellie's world for so long. Jonathan watched from a corner chair as Dr. Renee Marshall moved gently through the exam, her voice soft as wind chimes. Ellie perched on the edge of the paper-draped bed, tiny legs swinging, his own coat pulled around her like a lifeline. She didn't cry or complain, not even when Renee found bruises along her arms and thin red welts circling her ankles. She answered every question quietly, eyes fixed on her lunchbox, flinching only when asked about meals or bedtime. Jonathan's hands balled into fists. He couldn't look at Renee's face as she lifted the child's shirt and traced an old scar running up her ribcage, or when she gently examined the marks across Ellie's back. The doctor's expression was controlled, but her eyes betrayed a storm of anger and sorrow. Renee scribbled notes in Ellie's new file, nodding tightly. A nurse with gentle eyes entered and began cataloging injuries. Frostbite starting at the toes, old and fresh bruises in different stages of healing, hairline fractures along 2 fingers, never set properly. When she asked about how Ellie got hurt, the girl hesitated, shoulders curling in. Sometimes I fall in the dark. Sometimes the closet is just too small. Jonathan closed his eyes, steadying himself. In that moment, he understood with aching clarity. This was how children slipped through the cracks, not screaming, but growing smaller and smaller until they nearly vanished. Not this time. As the exam finished, Renee excused herself and returned with another woman, a sturdy, no-nonsense social worker named Karen Willis. Karen's badge hung from a faded blue lanyard. Her smile was kind, but her eyes sharp, observant. She introduced herself to Ellie, kneeling to the child's level, offering a coloring book and a box of crayons. You can draw anything you want, she said softly. Karen then pulled Jonathan aside for a quiet conference in the hallway. The law is clear, she said, flipping through her notes. With the injuries documented and Ellie's statements, we have reasonable cause for emergency intervention. But the system isn't always kind to last-minute heroes. Her tone was sympathetic, almost apologetic. There will be paperwork. There are always loopholes. But you did the right thing. As they spoke, raised voices echoed from the lobby. Marlene Doyle stormed into the pediatric ward in a swirl of cigarette smoke and cheap perfume, face twisted with performative outrage. Where is she? Marlene shouted, eyes wild. Where's my niece? She ran off again. This is all a big misunderstanding. She just likes attention. The nurse stood to block her, but Marlene spotted Jonathan and barreled toward him, wagging a finger. You. Who do you think you are, taking her from me? You have no right. Karen stepped calmly between them, flashing her badge. Miss Doyle, I'm with the state's Child Welfare Office, OCFS. Ellie is under our protection now. You will not take her anywhere until a formal investigation is complete. Marlene's mask slipped. Her voice lost its polish, and for a moment pure bitter resentment flickered in her eyes. You'll regret meddling, she hissed at Jonathan. He stood his ground, unblinking. Someone had to. Karen turned to Marlene, voice ironclad. We have photographs, medical records, and statements that say otherwise. Ellie is not leaving with you tonight. If you refuse to cooperate, you'll be escorted from the premises. Realizing she had lost this round, Marlene retreated, but not before throwing a final glare at Jonathan and muttering something too quiet to catch. Once the hallway cleared, Karen led Jonathan back to the exam room. Ellie was coloring, hunched over a drawing, a door, a big yellow star, and a tiny stick figure holding a lunchbox. She didn't look up as Karen knelt beside her. Ellie, Karen said gently. "Would you like to stay somewhere warm tonight? Somewhere safe?" Ellie's eyes darted to Jonathan. She didn't answer right away, but then she nodded ever so slightly and hugged her lunchbox close. "Can I have a nightlight?" she asked, so softly Jonathan almost missed it. He felt his heart ache. "You can have as many nightlights as you want," he promised. That night, with Karen's guidance, Jonathan filled out the paperwork to become Ellie's emergency guardian. "It won't be easy," Karen warned. "The system always fights back. But if you're willing to try, she's got a better chance with you than with a stranger." When they finally left the hospital, snow was falling again, soft and slow. Jonathan carried Ellie through the lobby, her head resting on his shoulder, the lunchbox clutched between them. For the first time, she let herself fall asleep, trusting him to keep her safe. Back at his penthouse, he made her soup and let her choose where to sit. She curled up on the couch, eyes heavy, while he fetched a soft fleece blanket and a lamp for the end table. As she drifted off, she whispered, "No more dark, right?" He sat beside her, promising, "Not ever again." For the first time in years, Jonathan believed it. As the city glowed far below, he watched Ellie sleep and vowed that no matter how hard the fight, he would stay. And this time, he would not let the world swallow her whole. Days passed in a blur of uncertainty, and every hour felt like a test of resolve. Portland snow had started to melt, leaving dirty ice along the curbs and a wet chill that seeped into the bones. Inside Jonathan's penthouse, the world felt both smaller and more fragile than ever. The news from the Office of Child and Family Services, OCFS, arrived with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Marlene had hired a slick attorney who filed an emergency petition, accusing Jonathan of kidnapping, manipulation, and exploiting his influence. "She's using every legal trick," Karen warned over the phone. "And you can't underestimate what fear and desperation make people do." Jonathan barely slept. He moved through his days hyper-alert, waiting for a phone call or a knock that might mean the end. Ellie, who had begun to find a fragile rhythm in his home, now shrank back into herself, old fears surfacing at every unfamiliar sound. She no longer hummed while she drew. She no longer asked for extra honey in her cocoa. Instead, she hovered near Jonathan, shadowing him from kitchen to living room, her lunchbox and battered nightlight never out of reach. The morning OCFS called, Jonathan's heart sank. The agency, citing procedural requirements and Marlene's legal pressure, informed him that Ellie would likely be moved to emergency foster care for her own safety until the upcoming hearing. Karen's voice was apologetic but clear. "We're bound by process, Jonathan. Unless you can get a court order, they'll move her. And it could happen as soon as tomorrow." Jonathan tried to keep his voice steady as he explained to Ellie. She stared at him, her face pale and drawn, gripping his hand so tightly it almost hurt. "They don't have night lights there," she whispered. "Or you, or Coco, or anyone who stays." The panic in her eyes twisted something deep in his chest. He could feel the old helplessness crawling back, the same way it had the night Claire died. His little sister's hand cold in his, her last words burned into his memory, "Don't let other kids end up like me." Desperation sharpened Jonathan's focus. He dialed Amelia Grant, the only child advocacy attorney he trusted, brilliant, blunt, and utterly relentless. "I need you," he said, and that was all. Amelia listened, then launched into action before he'd finished the story. "Gather every document," she ordered. Medical records, statements from Dr. Marshall, Karen's report, any neighbors who saw Ellie outside. "This is a fight, Jonathan, but I don't lose these fights." The next 24 hours were a storm of affidavits, signatures, and sleepless worry. Amelia filed for emergency custody, citing immediate danger and Marlene's pattern of neglect. Karen wrote a passionate letter to the judge, describing Ellie's injuries, her terror of darkness, her resilience despite everything. Jonathan added his own testimony, how he'd found Ellie, how she'd been left out in the storm, how she'd only asked for light and safety, never toys or treats. All the while, Ellie watched him with wide, anxious eyes, as if memorizing the way his face looked when he was trying not to show fear. That night, Jonathan tucked Ellie into bed, reading from a battered copy of Charlotte's Web, his voice breaking only once. When he finished, Ellie looked up at him. "Will you come back, even if they take me away?" He knelt beside her, smoothing her hair. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "Not today." Not tomorrow. Not ever. He tried to sleep, but nightmares found him. He dreamed of Claire, her hospital room washed in moonlight, her face impossibly small on the pillow, her voice fading as she squeezed his fingers. "Promise me," she'd said. "Don't let anyone disappear the way I did." He'd made that promise, and he'd failed her once. He wouldn't fail Ellie, no matter how many forms, lawyers, or judges he had to face. The next morning brought a sliver of hope. Amelia called, her tone clipped but triumphant. "We got the emergency hearing," she said. "The judge will listen to our case tomorrow. But you need to be ready. They'll fight dirty. They always do." Jonathan looked at Ellie, who was drawing a picture at the kitchen table. A house, a big window glowing yellow, a stick figure holding a lunchbox, and a hand reaching down. Above the drawing, in uneven crayon, she'd written, "Don't go." Jonathan hung her picture on the fridge right beside the court notice. Then he hugged her as tightly and gently as he could. He would not lose her. Not to the dark, not to bureaucracy, not ever again. The courthouse stood silent beneath a sky the color of dirty snow, the kind of morning where the whole city seemed to brace itself for something uncertain. Jonathan arrived with Ellie at his side, her hand small but steady in his, the purple boots he'd bought her leaving careful prints in the slush along the steps. Amelia Grant was already waiting inside, her arms full of folders and her eyes sharp with focus, her whole presence radiating a sense of purpose that steadied Jonathan even as his own nerves frayed. The waiting room was too bright, too cold. Jonathan kept glancing at Ellie, worried the tension in the air would undo all the fragile safety she'd found these past weeks. But Ellie sat quietly, clutching her lunchbox and a small stuffed owl Karen had brought as a gift. She didn't speak, but when Jonathan leaned down to ask if she was all right, she nodded, her expression solemn and brave. When their case was called, Jonathan took Ellie's hand and followed Amelia into the courtroom. The judge, Evelyn Harris, was a woman in her 60s, tired-eyed but kind, with a reputation for seeing past theatrics and into the heart of things. Marlene sat across the aisle, her hair freshly set, her lawyer beside her, posture stiff with self-righteousness. She didn't look at Ellie, not even once. Karen Willis was the first to testify. She described with professional calm the state in which Ellie had arrived at the hospital, malnourished, bruised, and terrified. "She was locked in a closet for hours at a time," Karen said, holding up the drawing Ellie had given Jonathan, and repeatedly punished for not bringing home food. The child's own words and artwork are consistent with long-term emotional neglect and abuse. Dr. Renee Marshall was next, outlining the medical facts in a voice that never wavered: old injuries left untreated, frostbite on the toes, psychological trauma. She flinched at loud sounds and didn't cry when examined. That's not resilience. That's learned silence. Then Amelia called Jonathan to the stand. He spoke quietly, recounting the day he'd found Ellie shivering against the wall behind the grocery. How she had spoken not of hunger or toys, but of darkness, and how she clung to the hope of someone simply leaving a light on. "She didn't ask for anything," Jonathan said, voice trembling. "She only wanted to know if someone would stay." Marlene's attorney tried to twist the story, accusing Jonathan of using his wealth and reputation to interfere, painting Marlene as a misunderstood woman who'd done her best with a troubled child. But even as Marlene took the stand and spun her narrative of strict but loving discipline, the courtroom was unmoved. Ellie never looked at her aunt, never flinched or sought her approval. Finally, Amelia approached the witness podium. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, Ellie Carter would like to say a few words." There was a hush as Ellie approached, her stuffed owl clutched in one arm, her lunchbox in the other. She was barely tall enough to see over the railing. When Judge Harris asked if she wanted to speak, Ellie nodded, voice a trembling whisper. She said if I didn't bring food, I'd sleep standing up in the dark. I tried really hard to be good, but the dark doesn't go away. Even when you close your eyes. Mr. Jonathan let me sleep with the light on. He never made me stand in the closet. He never yelled. There was a long, aching pause as the judge studied her. "Thank you, Ellie," Judge Harris said softly. "You're very brave." After that, Judge Harris turned over a stack of papers, her voice suddenly steady, decisive. "This court finds overwhelming evidence of abuse and neglect. Marlene Doyle is permanently stripped of all guardianship rights and barred from further contact with a minor, Ellie Carter. Furthermore, These findings will be referred to the district attorney for prosecution under state child abuse statutes." Marlene's face drained of color, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear. 2 deputies approached and quietly escorted her from the courtroom. Marlene threw Jonathan a look of pure venom, but Ellie never looked back. Her small hand slid firmly into Jonathan's, her eyes fixed ahead. Judge Harris continued, her voice gentler now. "Mr. Blake, pending final review, you are awarded temporary guardianship of Ellie Carter. It is the opinion of this court that her best chance for healing and safety is with the person who first saw her and chose not to walk away. A permanency review is scheduled in 30 days to confirm Ellie's placement and determine next steps toward adoption." The words echoed in Jonathan's chest, a mixture of relief and fierce gratitude so sharp it brought tears to his eyes. Amelia squeezed his shoulder. Karen wiped her eyes, and Dr. Renee smiled across the aisle. As they left the courtroom, the air outside was lighter. Ellie clung to Jonathan, her grip never loosening. When he crouched beside her, she looked up and whispered, "Can I tape my drawings on your fridge now?" Jonathan smiled, the first real smile he'd felt in weeks. "You can tape them anywhere you want, Ellie." That night, after a long day and a quiet dinner, Ellie taped her newest drawing, a house with big windows and lights spilling out, to the fridge. Beneath it, she wrote in wobbly but determined letters, "No more dark." Jonathan watched her drift to sleep that night beneath the gentle glow of her nightlight. And for the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was finally keeping his promise. No more darkness, no more closets, just the quiet hope that comes from being seen and never, ever left behind. Ellie's world was changing, and for the first time in her memory, the change didn't feel like a trap closing in. It felt like a door opening to light. Jonathan's penthouse, once a cold monument to his success, now echoed with new, softer sounds, the squeak of slippered feet on hardwood, the clink of cocoa mugs, the muffled giggles of a little girl who was slowly remembering how to play. Ellie's drawings spread across the fridge, crooked and bold. She taped up a house under a starry sky, her stick figure self holding hands with a tall man who always smiled. "That's you," she told Jonathan one morning, pointing to the figure beside her. "I made you taller so you could reach the moon for me." Jonathan laughed, real laughter, the kind that loosened something tight in his chest and ruffled her hair. He'd never been anyone's hero before. But in Ellie's drawings, he was always right where she needed him to be. Each evening, as dusk crept in and the city lights flickered outside the windows, Jonathan watched Ellie's rituals unfold. She lined up her new boots and shoes in perfect rows by the door, just so she'd know where to find them. She gathered her stuffed owl and her lunchbox, setting them on the nightstand beside her bed. Every night before she slid under the covers, she'd pause at the closet door, just for a second, then smile and close it gently, as if proving to herself that she was in charge now. Jonathan had quietly transformed the guest bedroom into a sanctuary. Soft blue paint covered the walls. Glow-in-the-dark stars trailed across the ceiling, and a lamp shaped like a crescent moon glowed warm and steady on the dresser. He'd found fairy lights that sparkled gold and hung them around the window so the night would always feel gentle and never vast. Books crowded the shelves, stories about brave girls and gentle giants, dragons and friends who never left. "It's all yours," he told Ellie the night he finished. "You get to decide what it feels like to be home." Ellie's eyes went wide, her voice trembling. "Are you sure I can keep it?" she whispered, running her fingers over the soft new blanket. "As long as you want," Jonathan promised. "I'm here. Always." Some nights were still difficult. Sometimes Jonathan would hear soft footsteps in the hall, the faint whimper of an old nightmare. He'd find Ellie curled up in the hallway, clutching her lunchbox, her eyes round with fear. He never scolded her, never told her to go back to bed. Instead, he'd sit with her, talking softly, letting her choose when she was ready to try sleep again. "Even if there's dark, it can't trap me now," she whispered one night, crawling back under her covers after a storm of tears. "Because I have my stars and I have you." Jonathan tucked her in and turned on the moon lamp, the room filling with gentle, steady light. He sat for a while on the edge of her bed, telling her stories about his own childhood, about his sister Claire, and the adventures they'd imagined on nights when the world felt big and scary. He didn't tell Ellie all the sad parts. She didn't need to carry that weight. Instead, he focused on hope, on the courage to reach for the light, even when the dark felt never-ending. Day by day, Jonathan saw the difference in her. She laughed more. She asked questions. She made up silly rhymes at breakfast, insisting that oatmeal tasted better when you sang to it. She invited Karen and Dr. Renee over for dinner, proudly introducing them to her stuffed animals and her art gallery on the fridge. "She's blossoming," Renee whispered to Jonathan after dinner one night. "You gave her something most children in her shoes never get, a chance to heal." One afternoon, Jonathan surprised Ellie with a trip to the local library. They returned home with armfuls of picture books, Ellie chattering the whole way about the stories they'd read together. That night, she drew a new picture, a closet, just like before. But this time the door was open, and instead of darkness, stars spilled out onto the floor. "It's what it feels like now," she explained shyly. "Even if there's a little dark, it can't keep me in. The stars always come through." Jonathan taped the drawing on the fridge front and center. On a quiet evening not long after, Ellie crawled into Jonathan's lap as he read, resting her head on his chest. "Are you sure you'll stay?" she asked, voice soft, eyes searching his for the answer she needed most. Jonathan held her close, steady and certain. "Even when you're not looking, kiddo. I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." As the city settled beneath a winter sky and the last traces of the storm faded, Ellie fell asleep in a home that finally glowed, soft, steady, and safe. Jonathan sat in the hush, watching her breathe, and let himself hope that maybe, for both of them, the darkness really was behind them. Spring crept into Portland quietly, melting the last snow from the city's curbs and breathing warmth back into the streets. For the first time in her life, Ellie Carter woke in a room that belonged to her, walls the color of sky, her name on the door in bright wooden letters, and a window cracked just enough to let in bird song with the morning light. She stretched beneath her new blanket, tracing the glow-in-the-dark stars above her with one finger, and felt something she'd never known before, belonging. The Blake home had changed too. Laughter echoed from the kitchen most mornings, mingling with the clatter of cereal bowls and the soft jazz Jonathan played while packing Ellie's lunch. The hallway glowed with fairy lights, each bulb reflected in the new gallery of drawings that stretched from the living room all the way to Ellie's door. Drawings of houses and open doors, of stars spilling from closets, of stick figures holding hands under vast moonlit skies. Even the neighbors noticed. People in the elevator greeted Ellie by name, waving as she skipped down the sidewalk in her favorite purple boots. One bright afternoon, Jonathan picked Ellie up early from school, and together they walked to the old alley behind Lambert's grocery, the very place where he had first seen her, shivering and silent, her back to the world. This time, Ellie wore her pink dress by choice, layered over leggings and a shirt, her hair in neat braids. In her backpack were cans of spray paint, rolls of painter's tape, and a stack of new drawings. Jonathan helped her tape the edges of the wall and stood back, smiling as she painted a mural in bold strokes, a wide open door, a path of stars leading out, and a girl in a pink dress with her face turned to the sun. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, she painted their initials, EC and JB, and in gold, the words, "For those who bring the light." That evening, after washing the paint from her hands and eating macaroni at the kitchen counter, Ellie changed into her pajamas and sat at the dining table, swinging her feet as she finished her homework. There was a different kind of anticipation in the air, a nervous excitement that made her glance at the clock every few minutes. Jonathan noticed and smiled. "Ready?" he asked. Ellie nodded, eyes shining. They walked together to the courthouse the next morning, hand in hand. Karen and Amelia waited for them in the hallway, both beaming. In a quiet courtroom, Judge Harris, her hair softer, her smile broader than last time, read through the final paperwork. "Ellie Carter," she said, voice warm, "from this day forward, Jonathan Blake is not just your guardian, but your father. This is forever." Ellie's breath caught in her chest. She looked up at Jonathan, who knelt beside her, his eyes shining with tears he didn't bother to hide. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. "I don't have to be brave every day now," she whispered, voice muffled but sure. "Because I'm home." After the ceremony, friends gathered in the apartment for a celebration. Karen brought a cake with too much frosting. Dr. Renee arrived with a basket of books, and neighbors dropped off cards and small gifts. Ellie handed out slices of cake, grinning as Jonathan hoisted her up so she could reach the top shelf and add her adoption certificate to the growing collection of artwork and mementos. "You stayed," she told him quietly. "So I stayed too." That night, as city lights flickered through the windows and the noise of the party faded, Jonathan helped Ellie tape her newest drawing to the wall above her bed. It showed a tall man and a little girl holding hands under a night sky filled with golden stars. There were no shadows, no locked doors, just light. As Jonathan tucked her in, Ellie hugged her stuffed owl tight and looked up at him. "Will you stay? Even when I'm asleep?" Jonathan kissed her forehead, smiling. "Even when you're asleep, even when you dream, I'll be right here." Later, as the apartment grew quiet and Portland's skyline shimmered beyond the glass, Jonathan turned out the hallway light. He paused at the door to Ellie's room, watching the moon lamp cast its gentle glow over her peaceful face. For the first time in years, he felt not just relief, but contentment, a certainty that the darkness was behind them both. In the morning, sunlight would find the mural in the alley, the words shining bright against the brick. And anyone who walked by would see what love and courage can do, not erase the past, but rewrite it with hope, with presence, with stars. Ellie was home. The dark had lost, and neither of them would ever stand against the wall alone again. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that love often comes wrapped in the most unexpected moments, then we invite you to stay. Subscribe to Emotional Tales for more stories that touch your heart, heal your soul, and remind you that even on the hardest days, tomorrow is still a gift. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.